Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, a production of WDIW Media, hosted by Joseph Pazar and inspired by David Michael Slater's book, We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them. Today I speak with Jack Jose and Krista Taylor. Jack Jose is the principal of Gamble Montessori High School in the Cincinnati Public School District. He is proud of their excellent rating earned in 2012 and for receiving an A in value added for 2 consecutive years. But he is even more proud of their work building community among students and staff. Krista Taylor brought a wide range of experience to her work as an intervention specialist at Gamble Montessori. It's her dedication to co-teaching and inclusion that have helped Gamble develop an approach that captures the spirit of Montessori education. In 2015, she earned regional acclaim when, after being awarded the Hawkins Educator of the Year award for Cincinnati Public Schools, she gave her entire $10,000 winnings to the Gamble Foundation to assist students in attending field experiences. Today we talk about their new book, Angels and Superheroes, their online projects, which can be found at angelsandsuperheroes.com, as well as Krista's open letter to Betsy DeVos, which you may have seen as it got quite a bit of attention. Links for their new book and website can be found in the episode description. Without further delay, I bring you Krista Taylor and Jack Jose. And I'm here with Jack and Krista. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. Having us.
I'm having you on the podcast because you've written this wonderful book, Angels and Superheroes, and I thought it would be advantageous for us to begin with the Reader's Digest version of how you came to write this book, and particularly how you came to write it together. My understanding is there was an open letter written to our new Secretary, not new anymore, of Education, and I'm wondering if that was the spur for the book. So just give us the summarized version of your stories.
Well, the open letter to Betsy DeVos came later. But it certainly helped, I think, open doors to make sure the book happened. The idea came a couple years earlier when we were working together. We had experienced some academic and social success here at the school. We felt like we were sort of clicking on all cylinders and doing a great job. And in my memory of it, Krista said we should write a book. She remembers it differently. And we sort of had this sort of idea of how it would work based on some principles that we had developed within the school. But I felt like, and I think we both felt like writing a book seemed like really big work that seemed almost at the time impossible. And I said, well, no, I could see us maybe sort of pre-writing in the form of a blog. And it sort of died there as it's just like a good idea. Yeah, we should definitely do that, but so what? And then that next year, Krista was named the Hawkins Educator of the Year here in Cincinnati. And she did 2 really powerful things when she won that $10,000 check. One, she gave that check over to our foundation at the school to make sure that 8th graders would get scholarships to go on our marine biology capstone project that we do at the end of the 8th grade year. So she gave all the money away. And the second profound thing she did was in her statement, she said, you know, it's really ridiculous that we would say that any one of us is the educator of the year, when in fact, across this nation, around the world, there are thousands and thousands of people who get up every day and give everything they have for the well-being of their students, to make sure their classrooms are ready, to make sure they have warm, nurturing environments to enter. And so it's like she said, it's ridiculous that any of us would be considered angels or superheroes when all we are is we're just regular people who work really hard. And she came down, everybody was congratulating her, and I said, that's it, you've named our blog. And we're going to call it Angels and Superheroes, and we're going to just talk about here's some steps you can take in your classroom to make sure your classroom is more nurturing, more student-centered, and here's why that matters. And so we started blogging. We started alternating weeks and talking about our practices that we do here at Gamble. And that's at angelsandsuperheroes.com.
Yeah, it's a great title. And how about you, Krista? Would you corroborate that account?
Well, it was Jack's idea to write a book. But it was also his idea to write the blog. And so as we were kind of trying to put together the structure of the book and looking for publishers and that whole intensive process, the blog really helped us refine our message and figure out what we wanted to say and kind of what our style was as well. And so they aren't the same by any means, but they certainly work in conjunction with one another.
Wonderful. And we'll certainly put a link to your site in the episode description here. But now on to the content of the book. I suspect we'll have vast overlap of areas of agreement, perhaps just a few areas of that require in-depth discussion. But to just get us started, from the very onset of the book, you talk about the nobility of teaching. And I wonder if you feel as though the feeling of nobility in education and the feeling of nobility that comes from society towards educators, and then that feeling that educators have towards themselves is also declining along with the deprofessionalization of the profession. And so you kind of outline this argument that not only is teaching a noble profession, but teaching is also something that's being deprofessionalized. And I'm wondering if you see decline in both of those areas, if those two things are linked.
I think that they're linked. I think that when you uphold a profession as being important and valuable in your society, that nobility piece comes with it. And when you undermine that professionalism and you kind of really cut to the core of society's trust in teachers, and then I think also teachers' trust in themselves, that you start to lose that sense of nobility. I referenced in the book the 2014 Time magazine cover, which talked about bad apples, which sort of sparked this idea that there are all of these bad teachers out there that need to be called, and that they're all protected by teachers' unions. And certainly in any profession, there are people in that field that aren't at the top of their game. Teaching's no different than that. But it sent that whole message sends this idea that teachers as a whole are lazy, that we don't have the best interests of kids in mind unless we have accountability measures placed upon us, and that we need someone external to tell us how to do our jobs and how to serve the students in our classrooms.
Watching what's happening, that's happening in Arizona and in several other states where teachers have stood up and demanded adequate pay. I worry. Well, I don't worry about that. I think that's a strong thing. When you use this term deprofessionalization, I think there is a tendency through the use of charter schools and through this use of subcontracting out education, there is a risk of that happening. But the public education movement seems to have responded really strongly in some places where it was most oppressed, and that gives me great heart in this time.
It's interesting you bring up the walkouts and the marches. I had an interview with a teacher from Oklahoma who was pretty active in the walkouts, and from her account and from everything I can gather, it really wasn't solely based on teacher salary. It was the larger issue of school funding, but even broader than that, it's about society's value for public education generally. And you make, I think, again, a strong case in the opening of your book that teachers are in some ways not trusted to do the work of education. So it's set up as though there's all these problems with public education, and certainly there are problems with public education. All the blame for those problems are generally set at the feet of teachers. So then the question becomes to policymakers and to lots of people from society, okay, then how do we hold teachers in schools to account for their students' learning? And by and large, that solution that's been enacted has been through standardized testing. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to this phenomena where you've got, students spending literally, with few exceptions, what amounts to weeks out of the school year completing standardized tests. And then along with that, if that's not the optimal way of providing accountability, how do we have accountability in public education? How do we know that teachers are doing their jobs well? So two things there. Is standardized testing indeed becoming a problem? And if it is, what's a better way of holding to account our public system of education?
Why don't I answer that first part and you can answer the second part? So I think thinking about standardized testing has been around for decades. It's not a new thing, but tying it to accountability, the accountability of not just districts, not just schools, but teachers, and now at least in Ohio, it's part of our students' graduation requirements as well. So it's gone from something that provides some kind of insight to teachers and administrators, especially as it relates to comparison across schools or long-term trends, something of interest that you can look at and reflect upon and consider shifts in your practice, to something that's done every year, multiple tests every year at every grade level, and drilled down to an individual student level. And I don't know that I can say that a standardized test gives me any information at all about an individual child that I don't already know. And the other component to that is these standardized tests are given in the spring at the end of the year. So for most of us,
almost the end of the
true,
year.
not quite the end of the year. For most of us, that child, by the time that score comes back, that child's gone on to another teacher, potentially another subject area. So it really isn't helpful to me in understanding how to teach the child. If I was looking at it as a composite, then maybe it gives me some frame of reference, but you're right, we're increasing the amount of time and the amount of money that we invest in standardized testing, and of course it begins to drive the curriculum because the accountability measures are so onerous that many of us feel like we don't have a choice but to teach toward that test in order to protect ourselves. And that is increased in schools that are in more impoverished areas. They actually spend somewhere around 200% times more on standardized test prep than suburban schools. And so our most challenged students are carrying the weight of most of this teaching to the test idea. But you asked a second question as well about how teachers should be evaluated and schools should be evaluated.
Right, and you go back to the study A Nation at Risk under the Reagan administration, and you see this sort of beginning of this attack on educators and this idea that the education world is a liberal hotbed that needs to be brought to heel, and we need to somehow rein it in so that people aren't, I guess, brainwashed to believe a certain ideology. But even at that time, the data showed that the number one predictor of how well a child is going to do on a standardized test is his parents' income, in which case all a standardized test does is keep the status quo and make sure that the wealthy stay that way and the poor stay that way. And yet, in the intervening 30 years, nothing has changed. If anything, American mobility between social classes has gotten worse than it ever was. So let's imagine then you have an educator, and in order to make sure they're a good educator, you put in requirements that they complete their college degree, that they have a major in the field that they teach, that they have this degree in education, how to convey that information, that they take a test in that area, and that they practice in that area and they meet this federal definition of highly qualified. And then you put them in a building with a supervisor like myself, an administrator, a principal, who has his own responsibility to the stakeholders who are the students and parents who send their children to that school. Don't you already have a professional? Don't you already have accountability in there? What does a B mean when it's assigned by a teacher whose area of expertise is that subject area in determining whether or not a child is mastering it? It means a lot more than whether or not they understand a particular standard or strand. It indicates that they've been able to maintain the work and meet the expectations of attendance, to meet the decorum of that classroom. I think that letter grade carries more weight than a 3-digit score, a non-scaled score on the air test in the state of Ohio, where a student might score a 620, which is completely meaningless to an employer. I think we've gone backwards in terms of accountability, and the secret is in understanding that we have professionals in these classrooms and professionals whose job it is to make sure they do their job. The answer is trust the system we put in place.
That's an interesting take. I suspect that part of the part of the reasoning behind such a large focus on standardized tests being used towards accountability is the idea that it's a public system. So it's a government-run system. It's a mandated system. So students are required to be in some form of school, most of which are in public education, and there's not necessarily built-in school choice. So you kind of get what you get from the parent perspective and from the student perspective and from the policymaker's perspective. So I wonder if that adds to this obsession of ensuring every school is held to account through student achievement, whereas in other areas of society, if something's not working well for you, you can often just find somebody else to provide an equivalent service. So yes, the vast majority, and again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, the vast majority of folks in any profession are hopefully highly competent, but what is the recourse for that parent and child when they do come across a teacher who's maybe not performing adequately to meet the needs of the student? And I just wonder if you think that it's not completely unique to education, but it's unique to maybe public services, if that's playing a role in why this movement to really test for weeks on end is gotten us where we are.
Well, if you think about the recourse for an individual child in an individual classroom, I would say that's far swifter. When the office receives a call, when a principal receives a call about a concern in a classroom, the response to that is far swifter than it is to the results that come back in June about the April air tests, and looking at that and going through that process. What I see in an observation in the classroom, I can respond to far more immediately than what I see in data on a test. I think we've lifted up the value of what's measurable, what's easily measurable, over what matters, and I think it's wrong. It's just led us down the wrong path, and it's wasted a lot of instructional time and money, and it's gotten some people fabulously wealthy along the way with taxpayer dollars.
Yeah,
and
if only we worked for Pearson.
Well, exactly, right? And what a shame that this private company has come in and they've been able to make massive donations to legislators in whichever is the most powerful group of legislators in whatever state they're in. They leverage that money and they make a great deal of money from it, and that's money that isn't spent on our students and isn't spent on microscopes and field experiences and kids planting things outdoors. It's money wasted.
Yeah,
and I think
I was going to ask you, Krista. Sorry, I was going to ask you something that stood out to me there was this easily measurable. So this focus on, we tend to only measure and over-measure those things that are easily quantified. So imagine a perfect world and you could quantify any aspects of a student's experience at school. What do you think are the most important things for us to know about? So essentially, what I'm asking is, what's the most important thing we as teachers and principals and even all the way up to policymakers should know about the experience of kids in school? That's besides how well they can do on, a math or a reading test.
Right. And, I think we often think about teachers as people in our lives who guided us, right? As adults, we often have fond memories of the teachers who served us, and we can think about the teachers who had the greatest impact on us. And almost every adult you ask that question to will tell you someone, or more likely more than one person. And then when you ask them, what are the what are the things that that teacher provided? What are the ways that he or she interacted that made them impactful? And it's almost never anything that's quantifiable in that way. And so building relationships, establishing trust, connecting with students really is what opens the door to learning. Without those pieces in place, learning can't happen, because learning requires a trusting relationship. In order for a child to take the risk to be wrong, to try something new, to push themselves beyond what they think they can do, they have to trust that they're going to be safe in doing that. And I think all of us as adults, when we reflect back on our educational experience, most of what are fond memories about those things aren't about the content that was in front of you, aren't about the curriculum, aren't about the books. They're about the relationship with teachers and students, and building that is what leads to deep learning. And so when we try to quantify these pieces, and then when we create these accountability measures that really serve to punish teachers, we're eroding that basis of trust. I had a colleague of mine in a meeting a few weeks ago say, we were talking about testing, we were coming up on the test, and we were talking about test prep. And she said, I know I need to do what's best for my students, but I also have to keep my job. And the idea that she felt like she had to make choices that she knew were not going to be in the best interest of her students' social emotional development, but that she had to do that to protect herself, is pretty heartbreaking. And this culture of punitive systems, this culture of using evaluations and tying that to test scores, is really demoralizing, I think, to teachers and students both.
And do you think there's a misalignment of incentives once that happens? So once a district or a state decides to tie your students' performance on some test that some private company has sold your state legislator or your state board of education, what does that do to the incentive structure for teachers? Because I think you've basically stated this, maybe in a roundabout way, but teachers tend to become teachers because they care about kids. So does that pervert the incentive structure for teachers and what they're trying to focus on? And if so, how does that do that when your evaluation is based on whether your most vulnerable students on whether or not they can perform on a given test?
Well, we don't really have an incentive structure that I could say was incentivizing. Really, you keep your job or you're at risk for losing your job. There's not like a bonus.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right, it's only stick. There is no carrot.
Mm-hmm.
And not that I would advocate for one, because I think we get ourselves into fiscal trouble when we try to look at that, because we're not creating a profit, right? We're not creating a product that if we do it better is going to bring us in more money. And anecdotally, I've been sort of looking at what happens in classrooms when testing pressure ramps up. And I got interested in it because I observed myself. And we were coming up on one of the evaluation measures that we have in the state of Ohio, and I had to give my students my post-assessment. And I was really like, everything in the classroom felt tense, everything felt angry, I felt completely frustrated with my students. And I had to take a step back and say, what is going on? And I realized that they were about to take a test that evaluated me, and that I was responding to their frustration with their learning, not in a way that I would typically be able to respond to them. And as I started watching, I saw it happening in other people's classrooms as well. And so I think it's more than just that we're focusing on this single test score. I think it's changing the dynamic between teacher and student. I'm seeing students that are stressed out. I think we're seeing an uptick in school-based anxiety where students don't want to come to school. There's lots of stories, especially of young students who have test-taking anxiety. And we're doing this as a society. And I think that those things are linked, and we need to start looking at that.
And would you say, it seems obvious then that that's also connected to the deprofessionalization of teaching, because it communicates, in addition to all those things you just said, Jack, I think, said this earlier, we don't trust you to do your job. We don't trust the system, so we're going to hold this stick over you and see how well your students do. Now, we probably are going to keep giving standardized tests, and I think there are certain benefits to standardized tests. So rather than stating how you'd like to see schools held to account, because I think you already did that, if we're going to continue giving standardized tests, and let's say we reduce the amount of standardized testing we did, how would you like to see that data used?
Well, first of all, I'd like to see a larger norm referenced database of information over time. We had utilized for a couple of years the MAP test, because there's such a large database of students who've taken it, and we know what growth looks like over time, that it makes sense. Here in the state of Ohio, we use the PARCC test, PARCC. I can't even tell you what it stands for. 1 year, and then the next year we discarded it because we weren't happy with the results. And then we were supposed to get a normed value added score as we went from the Ohio graduation test 1 year to the PARCC the next, and to the AIR, another acronym I can't tell you what it stands for, the AIR test the following year. How do we really have any idea that growth occurred in that student who takes the, never took the OGT, maybe, took the PARCC their 7th grade year, took the AIR the 8th grade year, and won't test again until they're in a tested subject, maybe in their 9th or 10th grade year. There's just no way to tell whether a child's actually growing. I think there is a value if you gave a version of a test that had content in it at the start of the year and immediately got those results back in the hands of teachers. I frequently would look at, when I was a classroom teacher, I'd get back my writing results, and I'd look at the strand data and see where I had missed helping my students. What area collectively did they miss? That's a deficit that I brought as a teacher. I would do the same thing with the reading scores. I'd look for trends in the overall scores, but they wouldn't tell me very much about this new incoming 9th grade class because they're my last 9th grade class's scores. So maybe a pre-test and a meaningful post-test that's related to it would be helpful. Maybe testing at the end of May instead of mid-April to see whether or not we've made a year's worth of growth in these 6.5 months we've taught them. I think those are two real simple changes that I'd like to see up front that would make it more reliable as a method, as a measurement of students.
And Jack mentioned the MAT test, and that's a really different kind of standardized test. So with the AIR test, students take a grade level based test. So the 7th grade test is different from the 8th grade test. And then the score is compared one to the other as a student moves on to indicate what their growth was, but it's a different test that they took. Perhaps measuring some of the same skills, but it's not really apples to apples. Whereas the MAP test is what you might call a SMART test. And so as students progress through a testing session, if they're missing a significant number of questions, it will ramp easier until they start getting them right consistently again, and then it will ramp up harder. And if they continue to get them correct, they will be given more challenging questions. And so you're able to find the space at which the child is proficient, and every student is seeing a different test based on how they are answering the previous questions, if that makes sense. And I think that's a much better way to indicate growth than a test that's given in one grade compared to a test that's given in a different grade, which is a different set of curricular standards. You can't really see, especially once you get to the high school level, a child looking at an Algebra 1 test and then a child in front of a geometry test. Those are different tests. How do you indicate growth that way?
Yeah, that's a great point. And from my perspective as a classroom teacher, the greatest value I've found, and I should define standardized tests, so it's a test that's taken by a lot of kids all around the district, and using adequate samples, they establish percentiles, so 1 to 100, where would a kid rank, or 1 to 99 rather. And then, they have standard deviations, and they have error rates on a particular score kids get. So by standardized test, we mean to say not a classroom, teacher-generated assessment, but something that's taken by kids across the entire state or even large portions of the country, and then normed off of that data. And those tests provided me the most value when they were given once to 3 times per year, usually 2 to 3 times, I should say, rather than just once. And I felt like it would corroborate or maybe even conflict a little bit with my perception of what was going on in my classroom. So I kind of have the belief that if I was doing my job well, and I've had good years and I've had years where I've struggled, that every single one of my students should be able to demonstrate growth on this assessment. But then I combine that with my intimate knowledge of my classroom and students as it pertains to their work in my classroom. And I know if there wasn't so much growth for this kid over here, I could draw pretty much a straight line to all the, to all these causes that's based in my individual knowledge of that student. And so from that perspective, I found and have found great value in tests when they're used like that. But, I couldn't agree more that when those assessments are used generally after the fact to rate an entire school or rate specific teachers, or to go down and just, try to give you information about an individual student when you're not using the same test, that we run into these huge problems. And then most significant from a lot of people's perspective right now is just the amount of time that's taken from learning to just do all the various tests. Whereas if we had, like you were referencing that MAP test, it sounds exactly like something that you might use to corroborate your classroom instruction, and to just go out to kind of this third party as a teacher and go, okay, I'm heading in the right direction, and to constantly have that check. There's one more thing I want to talk about before we move on from standardized testing, and that is this notion of why we're doing what we're doing in school. So I was going to ask you, there's probably lots of conflicting viewpoints in society on what public education is there to do, but what do you think is implied, what purpose is implied by all this standardized testing? So like, what can a student who comes to school and who endures multiple weeks of standardized testing, what does that communicate to the student about why he or she comes to school?
Well, I think there is a basic fundamental starting point, is that when a child leaves our classroom, they should have mastered the major concepts of our content area. I'm not prone to do it, but on occasion, I quote George Bush around the No Child Left Behind Act, and one of the things he was asked about was, what if teachers teach to the test? How do we protect against that? And his response was, well, they should teach to the test. The test is on what they were teaching all year. Of course they're teaching to the test, right? Yeah. There's a sense to that, right? Like, yeah, they should teach, and the test should cover what's in there. And I think that's our first expectation. I'll tell you, you don't have to be on Facebook long to see that that a society places a large amount of responsibility on the schools. Schools should teach home ec, and schools should teach how to balance your checkbook, and schools should teach how to change your car tire. Just immediately, and everybody sort of agrees, like, yeah, they should do that. There should be a class like that. Well, we have a first primary responsibility, and that is we need to expose our students to the content areas. We need to teach them to be critical thinkers and thoughtful voters. We need to teach them to care for one another and to care for the community. And many of those things aren't measurable in a test. But all of them they will need if they have to interact with an agency to pay a bill, or change their tire on a rainy afternoon, or rainy night on the highway. I think, yeah, we start with job one, which is the core subject areas. But we have to be careful not to place everything that we want a child to know in the realm of what a school should teach.
So in some ways, that's an interesting point. So the overemphasis of one domain of education, i.e. the cognitive domain, in terms of academic achievement through standardized testing, really tells kids, I think, almost explicitly, not even implicitly at that point, this is what school is all about. At the same time, society is demanding more and more from schools, social emotional learning, access to community resources, mental health care, all these things that I think are invaluable and that we ought to be doing, but that creates this internal conflict in the system. And I can't help but wonder, and I had this thought while reading your book, because I think it's in alignment with a lot of the ideas you espouse there, that some of the dissatisfaction we're seeing, the rise of dissatisfaction, and you guys cite some great research that I think clearly states that the job satisfaction of teachers is declining. Some of that comes from this internal conflict of being asked to do a bunch more stuff for students that we want to do because we care for our students, but at the same time being held to account on only one domain of education, and education's multidimensional. So I'm wondering if you would agree with that, if I have that right, or if I'm missing something there.
I definitely think that you have it right. I think you stated earlier, people don't go into teaching generally because they want to get good test scores. Typically, people go into teaching because they want to work with students. And as you said, we want to grow the whole child. We want to have social emotional learning happening. We want to raise responsible citizens. As Jack said, we want to raise students who care about each other, who care about their community, who understand differences, who can collaborate, who can problem solve. And it's interesting that you said that you talked about the singular cognitive focus. Gamble's a Montessori high school, and as such, one of the primary components of our program that is different from a traditional high school is what we would call at our middle school level field experiences, and at our high school level intercession. And we actually take a significant number of days outside of the school year to step back from a typical curriculum. And sometimes that looks like we go camping with our kids for 4 days and 3 nights, and they experience the natural world, and they learn some content things that are related to what they're doing outside at the campsite. But they also really learn about creating community, about crafting a sense of belonging, about pushing themselves and understanding what they're capable of. And sometimes, more often at the high school level, it looks like some kind of a mini course that's high interest and that they can delve deep in. And while there are certainly curricular components embedded in all of those are the places that our students talk about most profoundly as being impactful. On the last day of school this year, we asked our students to share their best memory from the school year. And there were about 55 students in the classroom. We had combined some groups, so we had about 55 students together in one classroom. And all but 4 of them, their best memory was something that happened outside of the classroom setting on a school experience. And I thought that was really remarkable. That's what makes meaning for them. That's what's important to them. And we have to have permission to do that. And it feels scary in a world of accountability and standardized testing to say, hey, we're going to get outside the 4 walls of the classroom for like a grand total of 10 days of the school year or 15 days of the school year, and we're going to do other things. And yet, I really believe that it is those pieces that help us do our best work in the classroom as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just talked with an expert on children experiencing homelessness. It's a podcast that'll come out either just before this one or just after. And one of the things she cites as the most meaningful aspect of when children go through that challenge, why they remain successful. So they took some time to focus on students with immense challenges that were successful, and it was resilience. And she was talking about the best way to promote resilience is to have those meaningful relationships, those authentic, meaningful relationships with students in school. And so we have to seek to develop those. And that can often feel in conflict with the other requirements of our job. But in fact, it overlaps, because when we get that right, students, like you said, do learn. They can only learn when they have that meaningful connection. And there's that old, cliche, and I think it's cliche for a reason. You don't learn from somebody you don't like. It actually matters a little bit. You don't have to be the most fun teacher and doing non-academic things all the time, but it actually does matter if your students like you or not. And I would
flip that around too. You said it actually does matter if your students like you, and I think that that's true. But I think that what matters even more than that is that your students believe that you like them, and that you like them even when they aren't showing up as the best human being that they can be.
Yeah, no, that's well stated. That's definitely true. And I want to turn to another portion of your book, because there's so much great stuff in there. We're not even going to scratch the surface. So all of our listeners should definitely go out there and get it. But I wanted to talk about chapter 4, and it's entitled Creating a Climate of Interpersonal Respect. And I think you've transitioned us nicely there with relationship building. So I'm just going to throw out this question, for either of you. We have often a disconnect between the life experiences, the cultural background, you name it, between the teaching staff and and the student body. And that's sometimes true, sometimes it's not. It depends on the school, right? Obviously,
Right.
it's great to have a representative staff if possible, but that's just not the reality. And it's definitely possible to have meaningful connections in spite of some of different life experiences. But how does one, and I think you get at it in this chapter, how does one as a classroom teacher go about that hard work of saying, my life experience is really completely different, but I still want to build an authentic relationship with every single one of my students? Where does one, let's say new to the profession, let's say you're speaking to a new teacher, where does one begin with that?
I think you get curious, you ask questions. One of the ways that we're blessed to be able to do it here, I say blessed, we've created a way to do it here by taking students out of the classroom really early. An experience they'll have in the first 12 days of school this year is to have gone on a 4-day camping trip as a 7th and 8th grade with their teachers. And you're all away from your homes. You're all away from your comfortable routine, and you're sort of forced into this community together where it matters whether or not you make dinner on time, because 65 of you need to eat, and that's including teachers and students, right? You now have a true shared, you're in community, whether you like it or not.
You and the burned grilled cheese.
That's a great point, to create a situation where you're all new to the situation. Yeah.
Right, and I've learned to be, I for 22 years of my career, I have been a white teacher, a white administrator in a predominantly Black school. And I've learned to get curious. I've learned to be humble. I've learned to learn. I've learned to observe. I've read books. I've been dismissed. I think it shows up I think it's in that chapter. I tell the story where a veteran Black female teacher just dismissed my curiosity, dismissed my ability to teach in general or to ever understand. And luckily I ignored her. I think you just have to be sincere, and it gives you the opportunity then to make mistakes. And then you have to be forgiving of other people's mistakes. If a child comes up, gosh, we've just had a fascinating conversation here at Gamble about racism. And several of our students alleged that interactions they had with white staff members here were racist. And actually ties back to some survey data we saw a couple years ago where our students were reporting that they felt disproportionately singled out by our disciplinary system. And the thing that backed them up was our disciplinary data said that, in fact, we were giving disproportionate discipline to our Black students. So one way to react to that is to just say, well, that's wrong. Their impression's wrong. The data's misleading. Or there's some sort of fault on the part of our Black students. That's the wrong way to go about it. The other way to go about it is to stop and re-examine ourselves. When you look at how implicit bias works, we know that it exists, that we make decisions, and the more tense the situation is, the worse our decision making becomes, based on these implicit biases. And so we have to stop, be self-reflective, be humble, trust that the child in front of you wants to behave, wants to succeed, wants to do well, and work with that child to get past the gaps so they can be successful.
Yeah, that's great feedback. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about everything you said. I wonder, so I was thinking about that behavior data portion, and you guys talk, I think it's later in the book in a different chapter, if my memory is correct, on what's actually indicated when any student misbehaves, and how that reveals. Well, maybe I'll stop there and just let you talk about that. What does misbehavior among a student actually reveal?
So misbehavior is the kind of thing that is the bane of every teacher's existence, right? I often say that classroom management is the most challenging part of teaching. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you're outnumbered. The bottom line is there's always more of them than there are of you.
Yeah.
The other thing, that teachers are humans also. And so all of us are engaged in our own responses to one another. And it's hard to pull yourself out of that moment of interaction where you're feeling disrespected, where you're feeling like your time isn't valued, and worse, where you're feeling like you're losing the value and benefit of your instruction in the classroom. And we all have those stories. I don't believe that there's a teacher alive who doesn't have a story that classroom management was challenging. But when you can take a step back from that, when you can take a deep breath, and what I often like to say is to quit taking it personally and look at what's going on with that student. Misbehavior is a form of communication. It's a really powerful form of communication. You notice that child. And it's a means to seek something, right? We don't always know what the child needs that they're revealing through their behavior. And there's a theory of Adler at the turn of the last century, actually, this is pretty old research, where he looked into this idea that misbehavior was fulfilling an unmet need for a child, an unmet need to belong, which is related to Maslow as well. And so you can reflect on your own response, you can reflect on how the child behaves, what the pattern of behavior is, and when you can move yourself outside of that personalized response and look at it through a broader lens, that's when you can really help that child. As the misbehavior continues, if you aren't finding a way to meet that need otherwise, their misbehavior is successful. They are getting a need met through their misbehavior. And so rather than exclusively rely on punishments or consequences to redirect the behavior, that's not going to fulfill the need. That might redirect the behavior in the short term, but it's unlikely to have long-term changes. But if you look at other ways to meet the needs of the child, to connect with the child, to help the child feel like they do belong in your classroom, that's when you can see actual change happening, actual growth, and that social emotional development that we know is so important for all of them.
Well, and one of the patterns that teachers fall into, and I think probably a possible criticism of us and our book and our approach is that we're just too gentle with kids, and we don't have high enough expectations for them, and we tolerate all sorts of behavior, and that's what's wrong with schools today. One of the conversations I often have with my teachers about misbehaving students is, so here's kind of the pattern of behavior. The child talks a lot in their class, is easily distracted, is often with his peers, maybe 2 or 3 times in the class raises their hand, gets called on because we're so glad, hey, there's a pro-social behavior, I'm going to call on them. They get the answer right. Then they go back to their distracting behavior. And we're upset with them. So we have a discipline and maybe a parent conference. We sit around the table and we tell him how smart he is because he gets all these right answers. And we get back in the classroom and the behavior repeats. And we're like, hey, we just talked about this. I thought we solved it. Well, if you have a child who's seeking attention, look what he's done. He's gotten to hang out in your classroom with his friends. He's gotten to talk to them. He's gotten to raise his hand and participate only when he knew the right answer. He then got a group of adults that he likes and maybe even respects around the table to tell him how smart he is. He was the focus of that whole conversation. So what if he had to serve a Friday night school or missed a day of school in the meantime? Like, he got so much positive feedback. But he didn't get challenged academically, and I don't know if he's smart because all he did was cherry pick the questions he wanted to answer. So we have to examine, what we're saying is, we're not just saying excuse all behavior. What we're saying is examine the child's behavior and examine your own behavior and understand that there's a complex interaction happening there that you're as much a part of as the child is.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, really looking at, well, it seems obvious only after you've heard it, but when you're practicing in the classroom, it's easy to lose sight of this. Look at what the student's actually obtaining from the behavior. And are you letting students get out of work due to their misbehavior? I recall in my own teaching experience a number of years ago, a student did something pretty severe in the classroom and then asked me, aren't you going to send me to the office? And I was like, there's no way you're getting out of learning math today just because So, and I felt at the time conflicted because while I wasn't breaking any hard rule or explicitly stated procedure, I was breaking a norm in the school. I was letting this kid off, essentially. Other people may have seen it that way. After, he had done something pretty, not cool in the classroom. But in my mind, I was actually doing the exact opposite. I wasn't letting him off the hook for the work. And so I actually think you bring a pretty great perspective, because the criticism, like you said, that maybe comes most readily to people's minds is actually undercut by your argument to begin with. The whole notion behind looking at what's communicated by student behavior is to hold students to a better account, to have high expectations. So, in fact, I think you claim the opposite of what critics might say about your view there. What do you think, Krista? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And you touched on something that we've done quite a bit of talking about here at Gamble, which is like this idea of a hidden reward. What's the reward for the student that we may not be aware of? And a number of years ago, Jack pointed out very accurately that when we were sending students to the office, they were getting like this huge amount of one-on-one attention from people that they often don't see. So a teacher would send a child to the office, the secretary would talk to them about their behavior. Oh, why did you do that? Oh, you're back here again. And then some teacher, like a former teacher or something, would walk through the office and talk to the child. And then Jack might talk to the child. And this kid's sitting in the office getting all of this awesome one-on-one rapport with adults in the building. And so we actually shifted our discipline in that way and moved, when you are removed from a classroom, to a far less enjoyable, I would say, a setting. And so it feels a lot more isolated. It feels a lot more boring, which is what we really want. We want students to be bored when they're removed from the classroom so that they want to get back. And the other piece that we changed is the idea of how long a student has to be gone for. So a teacher actually has the option to say, you're gone for the whole bell, or you're gone until you complete this reflection form on your behavior, and then I want you back. And that's actually really powerful, because the student misbehaved in your class. You send them out, they get a timeout, you get a timeout from them, which can be equally important. They get to kind of write about their behavior, and sometimes teachers will complain that the kid's not taking it seriously, they're not taking ownership of their behavior. But in part, I don't really care. They're having their moment on paper to be mad about what just happened, to sort of mentally process that. And then if they're back in my classroom in 10 minutes and they walk back in ready to learn, I'm great with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Keeping it positive, but still holding them to account, and then, reducing the time spent out of the classroom. The absolute worst thing we can do for our most vulnerable students, who often, not always, but tend to exhibit a large amount of misbehavior. They're already, some of them, struggling academically. The worst thing that can occur is to reduce their exposure to quality instruction. I wonder...
When I
go ahead.
Just a change we made is that any teacher could send a child to out of the classroom for like the rest of the day. Like, oh, it was so terribly offensive, you've got to go for the rest of the day. And while we still have that a policy in place, if the child does something that merits a suspension, they can be held out for the rest of the day. We did away with this idea that I could make a choice that keeps that child out of Krista's classroom. That doesn't get to be my choice anymore. The longest I can hold you in there for something that happens in my classroom is until the end of my classroom time.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's a measure of respect for the child, a measure of respect for the other teacher, that I'm not going to undercut your instructional time because I'm, like I have an issue with this student or this student's behavior.
Yeah, and I think that ties in so closely to your comments, on what you guys wrote about in chapter 4, really creating an environment for all students and having those meaningful relationships with all students. We really mean all students when we use the word all. So this aspect of proper and misbehavior in the classroom is vital to that overall picture. Because again, we mean all students, or we don't, or we're just saying the correct words. And I've been on a bunch of committees trying to select teachers over the years, and the first thing everybody will say, and I'm glad they do, is I believe all students can learn. And that's wonderful, but it's more than words, and that has to permeate every aspect of our practice. I wanted to go back to, but I still feel like we're moving forward in the conversation, but back to the opening of the book, where you guys talk about some of the international international comparisons that are made between the United States and in terms of like reading and mathematics. And I was surprised to see that we actually don't rank so poorly when you take into account the factor of poverty. And I'm wondering two things here. What does that actually say about the state of education in the United States? And should teachers be proud to be teachers right now? And if so, why?
So I think in answer to the first part of your question, what does it actually say about the state of education? If, going back to accountability and testing, if we are assuming that these standardized test scores actually indicate the level of instruction that a teacher is providing, by extrapolation, because we know for sure that schools that have higher rates of child poverty in them perform at a far lower level than more affluent schools. So what we're saying is that actually in America, our really good teachers teach in suburban school districts or wealthy school districts, and our really crappy teachers teach in inner city urban school districts. That doesn't make any sense. Like that just, I think we can reject that out of hand as a possible truth.
You're saying that would be the logical extrapolation from the premises you previously stated, and obviously that's a faulty conclusion. Is that what you mean?
Right, absolutely.
Okay, gotcha.
And so if we look at that, and we know that our more impoverished schools are our lowest performing schools, we know that nationally, we know it internationally. It's not about teaching. It's about what's happening to our children in our society. And our teachers actually can provide some of that healing. Our schools can be places where kids come and belong, and it can be a second home. It can be a place of nurturance. But when we're punishing our teachers in these same settings for what they are doing, and this idea of poverty, and we can get into adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, and all of this is interrelated. But when we point the finger at teachers as the people responsible for these low test scores, it really makes no sense. And then I've forgotten the second part.
The second part of the question is, should teachers be proud of what they do? Hell yeah, they should. And I think the teachers in my school and the teachers in my district should be the proudest of all. When you face down the adversary of poverty, and you come in here with a fresh look and enthusiasm every year, and take on these challenges and address the cultural gaps we talked about before, we should be enormously proud of the work we should do, that we are doing, because it's powerful work. It's society changing work, and we're fighting against what the PISA scores in the open letter to Betsy DeVos and the opening chapter of the book. What those scores show is that poverty is a pernicious part of a lack of success at schools, and there are teachers out here every day taking that on. And there are teachers who work in our most affluent school districts who do a fantastic job of building a sense of social awareness and social conscience and pushing their students forward, and they should be very proud of what they do as well. It's not an us versus them. It's not the haves versus the have-nots. It is everybody working in the direction of improving education in our country and making sure that it means equality for all. That is the goal. Is not that, hey, most of us or some of us did great. The goal here is we all do, and we should be enormously proud of every one of us should be enormously proud of the work we do carrying that ball forward.
You know, one of my personal goals, and I can say this for David Slater, my compadre in this effort, is to help teachers feel proud of what they do. And you kind of mentioned the demoralizing nature of some of the challenges we're facing as a profession. And I personally, every time I see a march in the middle of some large metropolis downtown, or a handful of teachers in their rural school district, staying on the street, advocating for public education. It certainly gives me pride as in the work that I do. So I couldn't agree with you more there. I would be remiss. I am mindful of our time. I know we're nearing an hour here, and I know you guys are very busy people, but I think I'd be completely remiss to not ask you to explain the evolution of the letter to Betsy DeVos and then how that made it into the book. So definitely give the reader something to look forward to when they purchase your book. And did you change the letter, and just give us the quick story on that?
It's kind of interesting as a story, I think, because it began in a conversation in a team leader meeting. We were sitting around a table in Jack's office trying to construct a testing schedule for students who had to both retake tests that they had taken and not passed in previous years, and then take the new battery of tests for their current year. And it was impossible. There were not enough days. You took into account all of the things that had to be done by law, and the amount of hours that we had children in our building, and it did not match. It did not matter what we did. We tried to move everything in all these ways, and one way or another, we were violating some law. It was this absolute ridiculous experiment, like a Sudoku puzzle that could never be solved. Oh. And one of my colleagues sitting at the table said, our legislators need to be here at the table with us. They need to see this problem. They don't understand. And I said, I agree. I'm going to write them a letter. And I think that was maybe in October, and it took me until winter break to have enough time to sit down and do it. And so I thought, I'm doing it. I committed to writing this letter. I'm writing this letter. And I started to research. And the more I researched, the angrier I got. And I spent days looking into it. And when I came across the PISA scores, it was such a visceral feeling of fury. Like, this is a setup. We are being set up and we are being misled. And this information is being looked at through one lens, but there are so many other ways to look at it, and no one's talking about that. And everything that I'm coming up with is corroborating what teachers believe to be true. And yet so many teachers are afraid that they don't have the expertise to say what they believe to be true, or that they don't have a safe space in which to say it. And I wanted to give teachers the message that you're right, and we all need to talk about it collectively, and this isn't hopeless, and we need to do it on behalf of our students. And so as I constructed the letter, it became rather long, first of all, and I published it first on the blog, and my son still makes fun of me because it was early in the life of the blog, and by the evening, by the time I was going to bed, I think I said, gosh, there have been 200 views. And by the time I woke up the next morning, there were thousands and thousands. And so my son still says, oh, what, Mom, you got 200 views? And very quickly, it became 10,000 and then 100,000, and it's approaching 400,000 views at this time.
Which represents like 98% of all the views we've got in our blog.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And every single one of those people should go out there and buy this book, because I mean, it really, and I'm unashamedly pushing your book here, but it's because I like it so much. The first chapter really is captivating, and it's funny because I missed the fact that was first an open letter. I'm not sure if you stated it and I just missed it, but I didn't realize that until after I had read it, and I thought, because some of the stuff was like, some of the notions were familiar, so I think I may have happened across some form of that letter, because I'm assuming you tweaked it a bit for the book, or is it verbatim the same?
The chapter is significantly longer and includes additional research on top of the letter. And it's not actually written in a letter format, but much of it is pulled from there, and at least the initial components of it. And then really, there was a moment where I think it had been posted for about a week or so, and I got a text from Jack that said, Diane Ravitch just read your letter. And I screamed and cried, and it was a pretty incredible moment.
Yeah, I gave it a help. I did tweet it. I kind of shoved it in Diane Ravitch's direction. She's a bit of a hero of ours, and because she's knowledgeable, and because she helped write No Child Left Behind, and because she realized the bastardization of it to become drill and kill, focus on the tests and evaluate teachers. She's a real hero for what education should be, and she's very knowledgeable. So I pushed it in her direction, and she replied saying about Krista's article, "She's right, great letter." And I was like, okay, we win. We're done.
Oh, that's great. And I'll just say one more thing here about the book. And again, it's Angels and Superheroes, Compassionate Educators in an Era of School Accountability. I really enjoyed the tips of the trade you guys included at the end of each chapter. So for teachers who are off on summer break, or maybe there's some of you poor souls in school, year-round schools. Either way, it's a good read because it leaves you feeling better about your profession, your work, but you're edified at the same time with some very on-the-ground level suggestions and practices. So it's not a book that's written up in the ivory tower of philosophy, but it's a book full of practical tips and concepts that can be easily applied where those are based in a solid philosophy of education. So very usable to the teacher. Thank you guys for writing this book. And then as we close out here, where can our listeners find you and find the book if they want to purchase it? Give us all your social media stuff and your URLs.
Okay, well, you can find us, first of all, on the internet at our website. It's www.angelsandsuperheroes.com. It's all spelled out, angelsandsuperheroes.com. There's a link there to buy our book. I think that's directly, is that from Amazon, or we linked it to Amazon? You can also find it at Rowman and Littlefield. That's our publisher. We're on Twitter at Angel Superhero. At Angel Superhero on Twitter. We're also Angels and Superheroes on Facebook, and we're at Instagram at Angels and Superheroes. And I think that's all the places you can find us.
Wonderful.
And ask for a local bookstore.
What was that? Your local bookstore? Is that what you said?
Yeah, ask for us there, please.
Oh, yeah. Great strategy. Yes. And thank you both so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, you can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.